Okay, before we begin the actual class, two segments that I'm giving in this year-long series in English. I want to announce what is going on this evening in our department. Right, this evening there is a special event. We're having two books celebrated from within the department. One was written mostly by members of the department and by other scholars. It's a book in honor of Professor Shmuel Vargon, who taught here for decades and retired just a few years ago. And you still see him around, and we're very glad when he is around. In honor of that book and Professor Vargon, Dr. Yael Shemesh is giving a talk on the heroism of Ritzpah Bat Aya. And if you don't remember who Ritzpah Bat Aya is, you can read the MA thesis of my former student from Tel Aviv, Michal Mayorchik, or you can look it up or come to the lecture this evening and you'll hear all about it. Second, Professor Yosef Fleischman has published a book on father-daughter relations in biblical law and in the ancient Near East. And that book will be honored by a lecture, with a lecture by me on the subject of the study of biblical law. And we'll actually look at one of the laws that he treats, and I'll say something brief about the way he treats it, and then we'll actually look at it from a different perspective with me. Okay, and beforehand there are refreshments. All right, it's going to be held in Ulam Bek, which is downstairs, down and around. If you go out the back door toward Kvish Geya, you go down to the bottom and around to the left opposite the cafe. Right, and there we'll have our own cafe or whatever, drinks and whatever else, and it starts at 5:15, but the program begins, I hope, right on time at 5:45. Okay, so try to come early so that you can enjoy, the refreshments and say hello to people before the program actually begins. Okay? That's concerning the event tonight. And now concerning this series. As you know, in this series, members of the department present for a week or two a particular theme that's of interest to them and the students. And the theme that I chose to discuss, having only 2 sessions to deal with it, so making it a kind of self-enclosed topic, is the subject of metaphor and metaphor analysis, how we understand metaphor today, and how we analyze metaphor in biblical literature in particular. Okay? So, wait one more second. They're also filming today. This is part of a Bar-Ilan project to put some lectures from the university on YouTube, and I assume it's an expanding project, and we'll see what comes out of this. I will try to be as natural as I can. Those who have studied with me before, the only thing that will be different is I probably won't sit at all. I'll just stand, but everything else should be pretty much the same as usual. Okay? All right, so there are 2 ways that things can be related to each other, right? Especially in language. We could argue that there's an analogy to be made in other areas of life also, but one of those ways is when 2 things are kind of next to each other. They have a relationship in space or in time, or in space and time. That is, this is next to this, or this comes before this, which means this comes after that, etc. And there's a relationship. And somehow the meaning of one gets transferred into the meaning of the other. Or to put it another way, one thing is understood in the light of the other thing. Okay? For example, the person who sits on the chair, right, can be called the chair, right, like the chair of a meeting, you know, the chairperson, yes? Or I can put something on the table. For example, let's say we have a meeting and a discussion, and I don't want to deal with it. So instead of dealing with it like this, taking it in my hands, I put it on the table. I table it, which means you leave it for now, right? You leave it for now, okay? So now what's the relationship between the person and the chair? The relationship is one of, right, one sits on the other. One is next to the other. One is on top, one is on the bottom. Okay, what's the relationship between the topic, let's say, or the agenda, right? Let's just imagine that it's on paper, right? And the table, what's the relationship again? You're allowed to talk. It's okay. Yeah, it's spatial. They're next to each other, etc. Okay, so who knows or remembers what we call the relationship between two things that are next to each other? Not exactly. We call this metonymia or metonymy. That's a particular type of metonymy, synecdoche. Where the one part stands for the whole. For example, in the famous phrase in English, right, to take someone's hand in marriage. You're interested in not only the hand, but in the entire person, right? Okay, so to take the hand in marriage. That's synecdoche, where part stands for the whole. But there's the whole larger category of metonymy. This is connected to this, and this is understood in terms of that, right? Because of their proximity to each other in space or time. Okay, that's metonymy. All right, the alternative is I have one thing, and then I have something else that overlaps it. I didn't really mean to make them so different in size, but it doesn't. Okay, there's an overlap between this and this. In other words, there's part of this and part of this that share features, that share, you know, something that is meaningful. And I understand this in terms of this because of that overlap. Or it can be the other way around. I understand this instead of this because of the overlap of meaning. Right, so one thing is on top of the other, one thing is next to the other. When it's next to each other, we call it metonymy. When it is overlapping, when one is on top of the other to some extent, we call it metaphor, metaphora. Metaphor. We understand one thing in terms of another. Now the truth is, if you were to analyze almost anything, you would find that virtually everything is understood by us by taking the unknown or the less known or something that is hard to express and trying to understand it or express it, to say it, using the terms of another area, right? For example, I can talk about someone's behavior as being rough. As being rough. And that explains something about, right, that behavior. It's rough. But is it literally rough? In other words, can I touch it and can I feel, right, that there are little bumps and things that scratch me or are uncomfortable as I slide my hand over them? No. But what I'm doing is I'm taking a behavior that is hard to describe, and I'm describing it in terms of something else, which I find easier to describe in this case, something that is rough, something that feels uncomfortable. And so if you want to understand what it means to say that person is rough, you have to ask yourself, what does rough mean when it is used literally? In other words, I have to go to the conceptual area where rough has a literal meaning, whether it's a piece of wood, or whether it's a stone, or whether it's a beard, or whatever it is. I have to imagine that, and then I have to ask myself, well, what are those features of the beard or the wood or the stone or whatever that I consider to be rough, and in what ways does it make sense to talk about a person being rough, right, using those categories? So first I have to understand rough before I can understand, rough in the literal sense, before I can understand how it's used metaphorically. Now, language is full of metaphor. We often think of metaphor, and it used to be thought in a lot of work on literature and rhetoric, that metaphor, was a kind of way of fancying up language, making language pretty, right? Making it elegant, making it artistic. And you do it, by taking something that's plain, right, and making it elaborate. However, metaphor is actually something that we do in everything in all of our communication, in all of our language. It's very hard to get even one sentence out without some metaphor. If you think about Hebrew, virtually all of the prepositions are metaphorical, and they all have to do with body parts. For example, if I say that something is mitachat, right? So there's an area of the behind, right? And it's underneath. Or if I say me'al, well, we know from Ugaritic and perhaps some places in the Bible that al also can mean the top. So it means above the top, right? Al yad, by the arm, by the hand. Eitzel, right? Next to the armpit, this part of the body, right? L'regel, right? By the foot or at the feet of. And we could go on and on and on. You say, if we want to talk about the surface of something, how do we say it? Panei, apanim shel, right? The surface of something, the surface of the earth. Does the earth have a face? Where are the eyelashes? Okay? In other words, we don't have, when you're comparing the two areas, there is not a complete overlap, but there is an area in which one thing is meaningful in regard to the other. And when you want to talk about the face of a thing, right, by comparing it to a human face or an animal face, you're basically saying that this is the part that you see. And then you have to imagine what is behind the face. That's a whole other story. Okay? But what's in front of the face is something else. Okay. If you want to say that something, it pleases me in the Bible, you say it is right in the eyes of, right? Or it is favorable in the eyes of something. What does it mean, the eyes? Why the eyes? This opens up an entire category because the eyes are the way that we see. They're the way that we take in a lot of experience and information, right? And so the seeing is a way of saying understanding. And in many languages this is the case, not only in Hebrew. We'll come to more examples of that further on as we talk more about metaphor and how to understand metaphor and read metaphor when we are reading literature. And I, of course, am particularly interested in the reading of biblical literature in this context. Now, how do we know that we're dealing with a metaphor? Sometimes it's not so clear. Clear, oh, there's a good one. Right, clear, what does it mean clear? How can an idea be clear? Right, something is clear if there's nothing interfering, if there's no obstruction visually. Right, that's what it means to be clear. Okay, so here is another metaphor. I'm just pointing out metaphors here and there as we go along. I'll stop doing that as we start focusing on some examples. But for a first example, I would like you to look at the book of Kohelet, the beginning of chapter 12, the famous poem, right, about aging. And for this purpose, here are some handouts copied from the Brown, Driver, and Briggs lexicon, which I assume everybody knows, the main Biblical Dictionary. You'll remember that at the end of Kohelet chapter 11, right, he talks about, right, the philosopher, right, talks about how youth is good and old age is not so good, right, and then he gets to the beginning of chapter 12. Uzechor et borecha bimei v'churotecha, right, pay mind to your borei. And notice it's not boracha, your creator, which is the way that many people explain it, but borei, a different word, which apparently in this context means your vigor, your health, like buriut in modern Hebrew. Yes. So remember your vigor, right? That's what makes sense in this context. Bimei b'churotecha, when you are still young, right? When you're still young. Ad asher lo yava'u yemei hara'ah. Before the bad days come, the bad days come. V'higiu shanim asher tomar ein li vahem chayfetz. Right? Until years come when you will say, I really have no interest in them. I don't really want this. In other words, a part of life that will eventually come in the future, which means, right, old age, in which a person is not as happy as one was before because of the problems of old age. Of course, today it's easier, but it's still not easy. Okay. Verse 2. Ad asher lo techshach hashemesh v'ha'or, before the sun grows dark and the light, v'hayareach, v'hakochavim, and the moon and the stars. Okay, here, in terms of the use of chashach, meaning to grow dark, is it literal or figurative, non-literal? It's figurative only if you take the entire sentence into consideration. But before we do that, or you're ahead, I'm trying to be simple, step by step. So, shemesh, can the sun grow dark? Yes, okay, well, because it really doesn't grow dark. You're right, from a scientific point of view, maybe that's what you meant. From a scientific point of view, it doesn't really grow dark. It's bright all of the time, but we don't always see it. So when we don't see it, it looks like it grew dark. And that's, of course, the way the ancients understood it. And, of course, just grammatically, you notice that you have the feminine verb preceding shemesh, which is here feminine. Elsewhere in Kohelet, remember in chapter 1, it's masculine. There are some, and that's right, like derech, etc., correct. And here we've got the shemesh. And because the verb precedes the noun, it agrees with the first noun and not with the others. This has nothing to do with metaphor, but we're doing Bible, and this is what we do. Okay, I never avoid language. Okay. Lo techshach hashemesh va'or va'yareach va'kochavim. This is literal, right? Until they all grow dark. But of course, what did you mean when you said, I'm sorry, your name? Well, what did you mean when you said that this was figurative? Okay, because it's not just talking about the sun and the moon and the stars. These are all metaphors for the seeing, right, the vision of a person. Right, light is vision. And so this is what we do when we have a metaphor, right? We put it in metaphorical terms. Light is vision. Okay, so whenever we see light, it's vision, because vision is like light. It sees things, right? It clarifies things. Right? Okay. We'll go into that a little more later. Vishavu he'avim achar hagashim. And the clouds return after the rain. Okay? So we have sunshine and then we have clouds, right? And that, of course, it's cataracts, or it's just life. I think it's more than just vision. You say that you see this as vision. I see it as more. I see it as about life in general. But we don't have to argue about it, because that's the whole thing with a poem. It can mean lots of things. Sorry?
Yeah, it's very beautiful with the geshem and the tearing.
It could be, if you can understand that way, but you can also understand, right, that life is cloudy sometimes, right? That is, it's gray, cloudy, depressing, et cetera, right? And we have these associations in our own culture, and I certainly would assume that in the biblical culture you have the same idea, right? When things are depressing, one of the ways to say it in biblical Hebrew is that it's koder, right? Koder, which means dark, right? Koder, dark, depressing, and it still is used that way in modern Hebrew. Okay, so we have the days of light, and then we have the days of relative darkness or gloominess, right, which is older age, right, whether we understand that slightly more literally as Geula does, or whether we understand it less literally as I do, but we can understand it, of course, in more than one way. That's the great thing about poems and literature, right, that we don't try to find one meaning, we try to proliferate meaning. We try to find as many meanings that work. Who decides what works? There's no police, right? We decide. We decide what works. And what works for you may not work for me, etc. But that's the way it works. Okay, now we come to verse 3. And I recently had an argument with a neighbor who's also a Bible teacher and scholar, and so my neighbor, my friend, argues that the following verses are all to be taken relatively literally, and some commentators take it this way too. And I, of course, follow Rashi and others and take it very non-literally. And we'll see how this all is relevant. Bayom sheyazu'u shomrei habayit. The day that the guardians of the house, right, begin to shake, right, to shudder. V'hit avatu anshe achayil, right, where the strong armed men, that is, men of power and position, hit avtu, where they get mangled, twisted. For me, these are the legs and the arms, right? This is a description of the body. But one can also understand it literally, if you insist, right? That this refers to literally people who guard the house, right? Or a building or an estate, right? That there you have the shomerim, you have anshe hechayil. Maybe it can work up till now, but as we keep reading, I would argue that it doesn't work. Why? You'll see. Uvatalu atochanot ki mietu. The tochanot, the female grinders, stop working. They're unemployed. Ki mietu, because there are few of them. Now, if this is taken literally to mean women who grind, right, who, for example, get the grain, right, that is harvested and then threshed, and they put it in between the millstones and they grind, in the front courtyard of the house or whatever, as we know from archaeology, that you could be doing that, right? How does it make any sense that the women would become more idle if there are fewer of them? I would think just the opposite. From a logical point of view, fewer people to do the work means there's more work for everybody. So that's an argument against the literal reading here. That comes from what I would just call common sense or logic. But now let's look at the next phrase, which interests me, and I will write it on the board. V'chashchu ha'ro'ot ba'arubot. Oops. They grow dark. The seers, female seers, in the windows. Can this be referring to female people, women, who are looking out of the windows? Windows. Arubot are windows, not chimneys. Arubot is aruba, we know from Ugaritic as well, right, is a poetic synonym of chalon. Okay? Arubot in later Hebrew comes to mean chimneys. Okay, so there are female people, or not people, but females, who are looking through windows, but they grow dark. And here is the trick. Can women grow dark? No. What grows dark? How do you know? You look it up in your BDB. Okay, look it up please on the page. Okay, this is why I brought you the page, right? So sometimes when you deal with any language in which you are not an expert, and none of us can possibly be a complete expert in biblical Hebrew. First of all, because not all biblical Hebrew is known. But second of all, because nobody is born speaking biblical Hebrew. We all learn it, right, as a foreign language, even if you're born speaking some other kind of Hebrew. All right, so when you look at this entry, chashach, from the Brown, Driver, and Briggs lexicon, okay, what do you see? Look down at meaning number 1, where you say to grow dark, which is used literally of light and the sun and the day and the stars, and it includes the verse that we just read before from Kohelet, verse 2, okay, where it said, Lo techshach hashemesh v'haor, etc. Okay, that's where it's used, at least in the immediate context, literally. The whole thing may be a metaphor, but in the immediate context, it's used literally with subjects that make sense. However, look now at number 3, right? Meaning number 3, to grow dim. Okay, to grow dim. It's used with einayim, eyes, and if you look in Psalm 69, verse 24, you'll find also there that it refers to the eyes of the tzorim, the enemies of the psalmist. And then, figuratively, it's suggested, it's used in Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, our verse, chapter 12, verse 3, where the subject of haroot is the eyes. Okay, there are no eyes mentioned, but how does the dictionary know, or the people who wrote the dictionary, of course, dictionary doesn't literally know, how do the people know that the ra'ot here refer to the eyes? From the context and from the use of chashach, because what you find and what tips you off that you're dealing with a metaphor is you find a word that is used in a context where it does not have its literal meaning. Problem with Hebrew is sometimes we don't always know what the literal meaning is. But let me give you an example from English that comes from an important article on metaphor and understanding poetic metaphor by Tanya Reinhardt, who was a professor of linguistics, poetics at Tel Aviv University until she passed away a few years ago. It was published in Poetics, the journal Poetics, volume 5, 1976. It's a difficult article, one of the most difficult things you might read about metaphor analysis. So it's probably better to read it after you already understand it, but it's definitely worth reading. All right, she gives an example. Her name is Tanya Reinhardt. Okay, so we often use the phrase that someone is riding the waves. Riding the waves, okay? And it refers to someone who was surfing. Okay, does everyone know what surfing is? Right, where there are waves in the ocean, right, and you somehow, either with your feet or usually with some kind of board, right, you get on top of the wave and then you ride the wave. Well, do you really ride the wave? Where does this phrase come from? Sorry? Horse is riding an animal like a horse. Or you could say, a Jenny ass or something. But, if you ride an animal, camel maybe. Okay, but the idea is that you get on it and then you ride it. And why is it like riding an animal? Because you have a certain amount of control, but you also have to deal with the forces of nature that are beyond your control. The animal is not completely under your control. The animal is not a machine, that you can control with buttons, et cetera, et cetera. There's a certain extent to which you can train the animal, but there's also a certain extent to which the animal is a semi-free agent, right? And certainly when you're riding the waves, there is a lot that you can predict about the wave, especially if you have experience. But when you're riding the waves, and I'm not a big surfer, so I'm not an expert on this. However, I know a little bit about it. I know about going onto a wave on my stomach. And when I grew up, in the summers, I went to the ocean, and I knew what it was like. I was very good at this, getting on top of a wave and riding the surf right into the beach. In any case, that's also riding the wave, right? You can predict a certain amount, but it's also a force of nature, and it's not totally under your control. And that's, of course, part of the sport of it. Okay, in any case, how do you know that riding the waves, right, is a metaphorical use of riding? Precisely because you know what the other sphere is in which the use of riding is to be taken literally. In other words, what Reinhardt does is to analyze it this way. There is a term in focus within a metaphor. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. Focus. Okay, and that in this case is the riding. Ride the wave. But then that focus is within a larger context, which she calls the vehicle, which is the entire area in which riding is literal, is a literal activity. The whole idea of whether it's horseback riding or some other kind of riding an animal, right? You can say riding a bicycle used to be a metaphor, but now you could say that riding a bicycle is now so customary that it's no longer a metaphor. We call it a dead metaphor. Or we can say that it kind of loses its metaphorical power. However, a poet can look at a metaphor like riding a bicycle, which most people don't really think about as a metaphor anymore, and can use it in a context where the metaphorical meaning becomes paramount, right? Becomes evident to us. For example, if we were to talk about riding a bicycle, right, and somehow attributing animal-like characteristics to the bicycle, right, or riding it over rough terrain and not over a paved surface or something like that. There are ways of doing that. That's what poets do, and that's why we have to be very careful when we read literature, right, to ask ourselves all the time, is it possible that a particular term that was once a metaphor is now being used in a literary way? For example, Job does this when he talks to his friends, right, and he uses the word panim, right, face. Right? He talks about facing the friends, and whether he says he will not lie to the face, etc., etc. You might find contexts in which face is used more than you expected in a particular context. Panim, even in the preposition lifnei or something like that. Okay, so you have to be alert to this type of thing. All right. In any case, this is one way to look at it. Starting in the 1970s, which is when Reinhardt wrote this very prescient article, scholars began developing a field which we call cognitive linguistics. The study of language, right, that is closely related to the way that people think. And cognitive linguistics, as it developed, turned very often to the study of metaphor. And in the early 1980s, I think it was already in the year 1980, there was a very famous book that was written called Metaphors We Live By. And the book is by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. They've written other books together since then, and of course many other people have gotten into the field, and in the last decade or so there's been quite a lot of writing from this point of view in biblical studies. One of the leading scholars who's applied cognitive linguistics in biblical studies is Ellen van Volde, Dutch scholar, and she published about 2 years ago a very large book called Reframing Biblical Studies, which gives you a very good concept of how to approach biblical language, not only metaphors, from a cognitive linguistic perspective. What you have to do is to look at the entire world in which an image or metaphor is used literally, and once you have analyzed that entire world, what Reinhardt calls the vehicle, then you can apply it in its various usages as metaphor or as a particular image or a phrase, idiomatic expression, or what have you. Yes?
What you just said makes complete sense. So my question is, what would be another framework of looking at things? What would be...
You want me to go backwards and tell you what they used to do?
Well, not completely. I don't want to take up all your time, but I mean, what is the other option besides cognitive linguistics based on what you just said?
Well, metaphors used to be understood before, right, in terms of tenor and vehicle. Okay, that is that there is a tenor and vehicle. Okay, the tenor, let me just make sure, I always like to make sure I get this right. That's the nimshal, as we say in Hebrew, right? That's what's being referred to. That's the subject that you're really interested in. For example, you're interested in the person surfing. The vehicle is the image, or in this case, the metaphor that you use in order to convey that nimshal. You can call, if you like, you can call it the mashal, right? That's the metaphor. And so basically all you do is understand, right, how the mashal conveys the nimshal, or how the vehicle conveys the tenor, which means the baggage that you want to convey from one area to another, which is really what metaphor is. It's conveying from one area to another area, or you could do it the other way. Okay, so what is being brought, what is being emphasized in the newer approach, right, is the importance of looking at the entire conceptual domain of both the tenor and the vehicle, or to put it in cognitive linguistic terms, the terms that are used by Lakoff and Johnson and others. All right, we're different, so you can see it. You have the source and the target domains. Okay, the source domain is where the metaphor comes from. For example, horseback riding. Whatever. And the target domain is where you're applying it. Reinhardt already, and I'm really very impressed, you know, how she anticipated a lot of what was later developed in cognitive linguistics. She already emphasizes that if you want to understand the way that a metaphor is used, you've got to analyze both sides, both domains. Not just the domain in which the metaphor applies, right? That is the tenor, so that we can understand all about surfing, etc., etc. But you can't really understand surfing with respect to the use of riding as a metaphor until you've really completely understood riding. And the other way around also. If you just look at riding and you don't understand that riding can be applied also to surfing, well, then you haven't understood everything about riding either. Because here, hey, look how it can be used in terms of surfing. Okay. You see? Okay, so going back to the text in Kohelet, chapter 12, when you look at a phrase like V'chashechu haro'ot ba'arubot, right? The female seers in the windows grow dark, it seems to me that now we can understand what the entire image is about, because here the ro'ot can't be people that grow dark. It has to refer to eyes. And if the people are eyes, then what are the arubot of the house, the windows of the house? Before the invention of glasses, the eye sockets, right? The sockets of the eyes, right? Where the eyes, right? Fine. Where you look out, right? Etc. Yes, is that so in modern Hebrew? So there I learned something I didn't know. Thank you. Okay, very good. Okay, so if it's the case for this, then it seems to me it's the case for the other phrases also, right? That if these are the eyes, well, then the shomrim, the guards, are the legs, and the men of power are the arms that get twisted and gnarled, arthritis, etc., and the right. And the, what do we miss here? Of course, the tochanot are teeth, which, and here it makes a lot of sense. You can't use your teeth anymore once they become too few. Here, you see, it all makes logical sense. V'sugru hadlatayim bashuk. Okay, now if you keep going, right, the doors on the street, shuk in biblical Hebrew can just mean the street, right? Sugru, they are closed. And what, of course, can that refer to? What are the doors, right, that kind of open out to the street? Well, imagine the person. What is the street? If the person is the house, right, then what is the street? The surroundings. Okay, what do you have that open you up to your surroundings that are closed? It's plural, it's actually dual. I think the ears, right? The ears. This is where you hear the sounds of the street. This is what brings you in contact with the outside world. Okay, etc., etc. We're not going to read the rest of this now, but next fall, I give a course in English on Kohelet. So at least it looks today, and you can. We will definitely spend time reading that poem during that course. Okay. Commercial for the department. Okay, now back to our examples. Okay, so what we want to do when we're analyzing a metaphor is to look at the source and the target. Now this language, of course, you might recognize from somewhere else. This is also borrowed. Remember I said almost everything is by analogy. Where is this borrowed from? Translation. There you have a source text, and then you have a target text. That's where you're trying to translate. So let's say if you're translating the Hebrew Bible into Chinese, right? Then your source is the Hebrew text, and the translation is the target, right? And the Chinese text is the target. We call that the source language and the target language. And I think that's where this comes from. At least that's my association, whether I just made it up or not. Okay, now, following what we've just said, let's look at another example of a biblical metaphor, which is used in a number of places in the Bible, but let's look at Psalm 124. Next week we'll be focusing more on Job. Psalm 124, Kof Kaf Dalid, verse 6, Pasuk Vav. Okay? Here, the reference, in case you missed it, is to the people who attack you, your enemies. Right? Back in verse 2, Lulei Hashem Shahaya Lanu Bekum Aleinu Adam, a person who rises against us. So these are the people who rise against you. That's who's being referred to. But now let's go to, as I say, verse 6. Baruch Hashem Shelo Nitananu Teref Lishinehem. Right? God, I acknowledge God as the source of blessing. That's how I understand Baruch. God is Baruch not because we bless God, because God is the one who gives the brachot. He gives the endowments, right? The powers to us. But when you acknowledge God as the source of your blessing, then God is Baruch. Anyway, that's another side issue, but I told you I can't avoid dealing with language and philology no matter what we're doing. Baruch Hashem Shelo Nitananu Teref Lishinehem. God is a source of blessing to us because he has not delivered us as teref lishinehem. Teref, okay, prey, right? Animals that are preyed upon by other animals and serve them as food. Okay, so who is the teref? We are the teref. Okay, so then whose teeth are we talking about? Oh, the enemies, except that if we were to understand the teeth as belonging to the enemy, then we'd have to understand that the enemy literally preys upon us and takes us in their teeth. Is that what our enemies do to us? They take us in their teeth? No, there's a whole image behind it. There is a metaphor, and the metaphor is indicated by two things. Firstly, by the word teref. Teref is always used, except metaphorically, right, of animals, right? Animals attacking other animals. For example, lions or wolves attacking sheep, right? And taking off the sheep, taking away the sheep or the goat, taking it in its jaws with its very large, sharp canine teeth. Okay, so the teeth here belong to not the enemies, but to the image of the enemy that goes together with teref. Okay, so let's just look at this. Okay, bye-bye metonymy. We'll come back to you again someday. Okay, so if we are the teref, the prey, right, then the enemies are, right, not only animals, but the predators. The predatory animals like lions and wolves. Toref. Toref. Right, and the teeth here, their teeth, right, means not it means yes their teeth, but not literally their teeth, but rather their teeth. In other words, their teeth is part of the same metaphor. So, in order to understand this verse, we've got actually to look at the entire domain of the source. The entire domain of the source, right? Who are we dealing with? We're dealing with predatory animals that grab other animals in their teeth. So we're not talking about vultures, because they don't have teeth, right? But we're talking about lions and tigers and bears, oh my, right? Lions and wolves, okay, etc. Okay, so jackals, all right, in the biblical terrain. Okay, so we've got the source, and the target is the enemies. And now the question is, and I think it's a very interesting question. I've asked this question in some of my work. In fact, in the article that I think you're supposed to read for next week by me on metaphors in Job. No? Did you get such an article? Okay. Whatever. Okay. In any case, the idea is, what can we learn now about the target domain, about the way that people are preyed upon by other people, by their enemies, such that it makes sense that we are the teref, we are the prey, and they are the predators, the enemies. In other words, now we can learn even more about the lions. Because we usually think of it as completely natural that a lion, for example, would eat a sheep or a goat. Right? That's what they're made to eat. And in fact, in Psalm 104, right, God takes care of the lions, etc., and gives them food. And in fact, in the answer to Job by God, in Job chapter 39, there too, God provides food to the animals of prey, the beasts who are predatory, which maybe says something about God, which may not be altogether pleasant to our theologies today. In any case, what can we learn, though, about this whole relationship? Well, it may be natural from a certain point of view, but from the perspective of the psalmist who is using this metaphor, and it's used several times in Psalms, and it's taken for granted in Job also, as we might see, then there's a moral evaluation being made here of the lions, that there's something bad about being predatory. Because who is predatory? Not I, in taking advantage, you might say, of other people so that I can achieve my worthy goals. No, it's considered a bad thing, but bad people prey on people who are weaker than they, right? Who are innocent and who wouldn't do criminal acts, wouldn't perform criminal acts, but the lions would, that is, the enemies would, the bad people would, etc. And so we learn something about the concept of lion here from looking at the way that it's applied in the target domain. It's not just simply, right, another animal out there in nature. There is an evaluation that's being made here. And that evaluation has an impact on how we understand the source domain. So I hope this has helped to understand how, by looking at the target, we can understand something more about the source, or at least the way the source is perceived in the particular literature that we're reading. Okay, now, before we go further, I want to make the point that we're used to thinking of metaphor as a highly poetic device. And in fact, it is a device that we find a lot in poetry. So much so that in biblical studies, especially in the 1980s, there's a wonderful article by Francis Landy. Put it here. Which appeared in the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament, JSOT, in the early 1980s, about 83, something like that, where he talks about the importance of metaphor in biblical studies. If you want to understand how metaphor can be treated without all of the terminology and the fancy stuff, but with a great poetic sensibility, read the work of Francis Landy. He has a wonderful book on the Song of Songs called Paradoxes of Paradise, and he has a reading of the book of Hosea, and he has articles. In any case, in this particular article, he makes the point, going back actually to the Renaissance and to the work of Giambattista Vico, Vico, that I can certainly pronounce pretty easily, right? Where Vico had suggested that there are basically two modes of seeing things. right? One mode is like the metonymic mode. I told you we'd come back someday to metonym, right? That is, that things are aligned with each other in time and in space. This comes before this, right? This is located in this relationship to that, etc. That's a way of looking at things. That's what we call this prose. A prose way of seeing things. This comes before this comes after this, and you can see it in the biblical verbs, right? Vayomer, vayelech, etc., etc. One thing comes after the other, after the other, after the other. There's a chronological sequence, right, etc. Spatial array of things. Okay. However, there's also a way of seeing things metaphorically, and this is the poetic mode or the metaphoric mode. That is, for people like Landy, and I think for many poets, right, seeing one thing in terms of another is the very essence of poetry. And in fact, Professor Meir Weiss, who was for a long time almost the only person with a position in the university in Bible in this country, whose work was completely literary. Professor Meir Weiss, may rest in peace, of the Hebrew University, in his book Hamikra Kidmuto, which has gone through 3 editions, right? He says metaphor is the very heart of poetry. If you're talking about form and recognizing a poem in the Bible, then you have to think about parallelism and what parallelism means, and I could talk about that for a long time, but I'm not going to because that's not our subject for today. Okay? Basically, lines that are kind of balanced. Right? 2 parts of a line, balanced, or 2 or more parts, balanced with each other. Okay, but that's parallelism. That's how you know a poem when you see one. But there's a whole metaphorical way of seeing things, which is one thing in terms of the other. It's a perception. You can say that it's creative because the poet understands how one thing can be seen as something else and can give you all sorts of insights and feelings about something that you'd not thought about before. For example, Tanya Reinhardt brings the example from T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which was his first great poem. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes. Well, does fog rub its back? No. This probably, I think, goes back to a poem by Carl Sandburg about fog. Right? Fog comes in on little cat feet. So the idea of fog moving around kind of slowly and almost imperceptibly and softly as fog, right? That is that is basically the same metaphor. However, T.S. Eliot takes it another step. The fog rubs its back. In other words, it's a cat, but now it's doing other things that cats do. Not just moving around like a cat, but it's rubbing its back, right, on the window panes. Great image. Could you think of a better way in all of the prose that you have at your disposal to describe what it's like when the fog comes up against the window pane? Okay. It's this image. This is, you might say, the essence of poetry. And this is what poets do, seeing things in terms of another. Some metaphors are used by other people, and other metaphors come into being because someone has thought of them, and you don't have to be a poet to think of them. Sometimes it's people doing advertising who think of these things, etc. But we have a metaphor, right, as a whole way of seeing things, whether it's God as a warrior or God as king, right? God is a lot of things in the Bible. God as rock, right? Immovable. How can God be king and a rock? Person and an inanimate object. Well, God can't, except that there's a whole way of thinking about God as king. There's a way of thinking about God as rock. There's a way of thinking about God as mother. There's a way of thinking about God as father. right? There's a way of thinking about God as a lion ready to attack, as we find in the book of Lamentations. Am I right? Okay. All right. We have, dissertating on animal imagery in Lamentations and in Chinese limits. Okay. So we have a number of ways of using metaphors to convey concepts, and you don't have to be consistent, because this is not Aristotle, this is not logic, this is thinking. Logic is only one way of thinking, right? Metaphor is another way of thinking, and it can be not only creative but extremely insightful when you come up with a metaphor. But it's not only used in poetry, that's where I'm leading. It's also used in prose. Okay, let's just take one simple example, and then we'll go to some examples from real prose, right? First we'll do kind of semi-prose, and then we'll go into real prose. For example, let's just look at the very beginning of the Bible, right? Bereshit, Perek Aleph. Genesis 1. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Okay? There are metaphors. Who can find metaphors already in this language? This is not what I'm going to focus on, but where can you find metaphors here? Well, whoever wrote this didn't think about jumping in feet first, because the word for the first thing is reshit, from rosh, right? The head comes first. That's one way of seeing things, but it's not always the head that goes first. Okay, but somehow that became fixed in the Hebrew language and in other ancient languages, that first comes the head. Bara Elohim. We're not really sure what bara means. I'm inclined to think that it's connected to that whole family of verbs, like the bet resh something, bet resh resh, bet resh dalid, pei resh resh, pei resh dalid, which means to separate, And since lahavdil, to separate, is used quite a bit in this chapter, I think that bara, the act of God's creating, may have something to do with taking what already exists and separating it, or possibly cutting it into shapes out of the chaos in which it is found, the inchoate form in which we find it. Okay, but as I say, I'm not interested so much in this verse, I'm interested in what comes afterwards. Okay, so at the time that God began to create the sky and the land, v'ha'aretz hayata tohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei tehom, as if tehom had a face, right? The waters of chaos, right, have a face, and darkness is over that face, right? There's darkness over that face. And the whole concept of what choshech is, not as an absence of light, but as choshech, darkness, is a whole other subject, which we're not going to be able to go into today. It's a subject that happens to interest me, because I think you need to understand it to understand Job chapter 3, where the light of day is engulfed by all sorts of darkness. And I have actually literature on this. I have books on the night and darkness. And yes, Gula.
Window of understanding this that I never thought of before. You said that it doesn't jump in feet first, and I realized that the Torah is describing a birth. The birth is head first, and the birth of the world is a head first birth, and the description then goes to the inside of the womb, which is dark and full of water, and then the emergence from the womb into light. It's very much the image of birth.
Very nice. Okay, you'll develop that. It's fine. That's not where I'm going, so you'll forgive me for not taking it up. But no, that's the idea, though. That's the whole thing. We get ideas, right? Poets give us all sorts of ideas, as well as new language, because they're not afraid of making up new words, right? It's not like the teacher, keeps, correcting all of the language, et cetera, because sometimes your use of language is creative and innovative, trying to say things that hadn't been said before. Okay. Anyway, So, but the earth, okay, is tovavo, choshech al panei tehom, veruach Elohim mirachefet al panei hamayim. There we've got the mayim again, parallel to tehom, right? The water has a face, but I'm interested now in the wind of God, whatever this means, whether it's wind, spirit of God. That is actually not my concern right now. Mirachefet al panei hamayim. Mirachefet. What do we know about this verb lirachef? Yes, it's the fluttering, the hovering of a bird. It's the flying of a bird. This is l'rachef. It's already in Ugaritic, right? The bird, the vultures that fly in the Akkad epic, right? And Anat, who flies among them, mirachefim. Okay, very good. Okay, so here the ruach is mirachefet. So the wind here is hovering or fluttering like a bird. Like a bird. Now, how far are we going to take this? Now, of course, I don't know about you, but the verse that comes to my mind right away is that in Ha'azinu, Shirat Ha'azinu, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11, that when God finds the Israelites in the wilderness, right? When God finds the Israelites in the wilderness and takes them to God's self, God is like, and this is not a metaphor, this is a dimui, right? This is a simile, because it's a specific comparison or analogy. Verse 11, Kenesha Yair Kino, like an eagle or vulture that protects its nest. It's a rare verb. Protects, yes. It's I don't want to go into it. It's probably related to Ugaritic Nagaru, which is related to Natsar in Hebrew, and it's used also in Job. Job, the author of Job, loves rare language, and this is the only other place it's used. I could explain to you why with a parallel from Assyrian, but okay, but well not right now, but we can do that. Okay, Al Gozalav Yurachef. Okay, Al Gozalav Yurachef. He, and interesting here, it's not the mother bird, but the father bird here, who is merachef, hovering, right, fluttering over its young, right, the young birds. Yifros knafav yikacheu, right, he spreads out his wings and takes him. Takes him how? Is it with the beak? Is it with the talons, right, the feet? Not clear. Yisa'eu al evrato. Carries him on his wings. Now that's not really how birds carry their young, okay, but that's the image that's used here, because this poem was written by a poet who was interested in more than one image, and not by a zoologist or an ornithologist, right, who studies birds, right? In other words,
but an eagle, when in Exodus, when וישא אתכם על כנפי נשרים.
Yes.
אז יש כאן את הפירוש.
No, that's the image. But as I say, but from what I've read, it is not accurate that that's actually how the birds do it. But that's the image that's used, that God carries them on the wings.
The eagle does not take his
young on the wings. I read not. Okay.
I actually recently read something interesting where the bird goes through a flying exercise where the young is dropped, and then the bird is observed flying beneath the young, and as the young falls, catches it on its wings. So it's not actually carrying it, but that does happen in nature.
That may happen, but that's not the typical way of carrying from what I've read. But my point is, but you see what we're doing now? We're exploring the source domain to understand how this metaphor and this image may be used in the target about God taking the Israelites.
But the poet and the writer live in the nature. They saw things, so they use what they saw from the birds and the.
Okay, I don't want to get into a whole discussion of this, but there are other places in the Bible also where claims that are made about certain animals are not, biologically correct.
Okay.
That's what I understand, so it's zoologically correct. But it doesn't matter. Okay, we can explore this. We find that everything I just said is wrong, and that is the way that they care. Okay, but the point is, this is the kind of research you have to do, and this is the kind of thinking you have to do in order to understand the use of the image or metaphor if we're dealing with metaphor.
I'm sorry, I don't want to take too much time and that you want to go in a different direction with this. This happened to pique my curiosity specifically because I was recently looking into this. And it could be that specifically in this case, that we're assuming that the text is talking about a particular type of carrying, where if we really looked at the way that it actually happens, we'll understand that it's not talking about that at all. And I think that in this particular case, what's actually saying is that God gives us the ability to make mistakes and to fall. And that's counterintuitive to what we would have assumed just reading the text, that by looking at nature, then we understand what the text is really expressing.
That is an excellent hypothesis, which we should think about. Okay, and understanding. Okay, that's a new direction of thought, at least for me. But thank you. I will not forget that. I will continue to think that way. Very good. But that's all part of the research. That's part of what we do as readers, because the meaning of the text is not out there. The meaning of the text is in here. The meaning of the text is what it means inside my understanding, my head, your understanding, et cetera, and therefore we're never going to actually have the same text because it's all going to be different in everybody's head. That's a whole other topic, but I'm not going to develop that now. But you understand what I'm saying, right? That each of us brings a certain fund of knowledge and a certain sensibility and certain sensitivity to the reading of text. Anyway, when you read Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, and you hear about the Ruach Elohim Mirachefet, you understand, right, that there is a metaphor here, and you imagine the bird, right? And then you begin to ask, in what ways is the wind like the bird? And is it possible that the bird is actually hovering over the water as a form of protection, or a form of nurturing or care? I'm not going to answer these questions. These are questions that I'm raising that I think one has to raise, and one may find in the end that no, this is part of the source domain that doesn't fit the target, or maybe it does. But you don't know until you've asked the questions. And that's my point. That's a point that's also made very beautifully by Francis Landy and others. Right? Landy, for example, deals with the image in the Song of Songs, right? Chapter 4, verse 12. Right? A locked garden is my sister, my bride. Right? Gan Naul. And what does it mean for a woman, a young woman in this case, to be a locked garden? Let me just read you some of what he says about this. He says that, well, some people argue that it just refers to the fact that she's still a virgin, that she's kind of been protected, that she's a virgin. Kala achoti kala gan naul. Song of Songs, Shir Shirim 4:12. But he says that may only be one of the implications. The potentiality of a metaphor, that means the full meaning that can be drawn from this metaphor, while not inexhaustible, in other words, there are limits, is usually multiple. In other words, there are a number of different meanings that it can have. Otherwise, it would be superfluous. A garden is private, secure, and beautiful. All of these things are possible ways of characterizing the young woman. In it, nature is humanized, like the girl. In other words, the garden is on the other side. The garden now is being compared to the girl, not just the girl to the garden, and therefore there's a certain humanity that is given over to the garden. Remember, I told you it works both ways. In it, nature is humanized like the girl, whose genetic endowment is perfected through culture. Right? That is, you tend the garden, you make it better, and a person who is born with certain physical attributes, right, can have those attributes can be improved through cultivation, right, through culture. She, like the garden, is her own creation, fostered by her parents and society, secluded both as a girl in the ancient world and as a human being with an innate sensitivity and capacity for growth. She is enclosed in her person, within herself, protected by the defenses that preserve her identity, her unique privacy. You see how he's taking this image, and instead of just saying, well, X equals Y, he's saying, let me explore all the possible ways that this young woman may be like the cloistered garden. Okay. Now I'd like to look at notes here. Okay. To some metaphors that are used in very prosy prose in the Bible. Okay? And we can find two in one particular chapter. Please turn to 1 Samuel 25. Shmuel Aleph Kaf Hey. Okay, now these are taken from a book by Andrea Weiss. Called Figurative Language in Biblical Prose Narrative, Metaphor in the Book of Samuel. It was a Vetus Testamentum supplement published in 2006. Okay, and she brings these examples. Okay, you may recall that in this particular chapter, King David, or before he's king actually, David has a private army, and he needs his private army to be supplied, right? Where are they going to get provisions? Okay, so he sends messengers to Nabal at the Carmelite, right, at Carmel, Mount Carmel, who's married to the famous Abigail, right? And they send messengers to him, and he is very gruff with them, right? He's not nice to them. But what is exactly the language that's used there? Okay, in the report to Abigail by David's messengers, this is the way it's described. 1 Samuel 25, verse 14. V'la'Abigail eshet Naval higid na'ar echad mehane'arim lemor. One of the various young men serving David says the following to Abigail. Hine shalach David malachim me'amidbar livarech et Adonenu. Right? David sent messengers from out there in the wilderness to bring greetings, right? To be nice, right? To our Lord, be a very obsequious way of speaking about Naval, because he, after all, is the rich man from whom they want the provisions. Vaya'at bahem. Vaya'at bahem. Okay, this is a verb which is probably derived from the noun ayat. Ayat, the vultures, right? The vulture, the birds that scavenge. They look around for corpses of animals, or perhaps even humans, and when they find them, they swoop down and they take them up for their food, right? You may recall that Abraham has trouble with the ayat in Genesis 15 when he makes the covenant between the pieces, Brit Ben Abitarim, and the ayat comes, right? The birds of prey come in order to take away this carrion, this slain meat, and Abraham has to sweep them away.
So the name of the bird is
ayat is just the category.
it's based on the verb, not the opposite.
I'm not sure about that. I think in this case it may be that the verb is from the noun. We call it denominative verb. In other words, a verb, the act of what the ayat does is ut, or ayat. It's from the root ayin yud tet or ayin vav tet. Vaya'at, so it means kind of to swoop down like one of these birds of prey. Okay, so vaya'at bahem, which is usually taken to mean, he abused them in some way. Maybe he spoke badly to them. He was mean to them. He was rough to them. but he kind of, imagine, that's the only way to understand the verb is to conjure up the entire image of how it is that the birds come down onto the carrion, onto the meat, the dead meat that they're going to take away. Okay, so this whole act of ayat, right, is what's being described here. That's how he came on them. He saw them as victims. He saw them as objects of his abuse, that he had more power than them. He could do with them as he would. He had control over them because they were like the dead meat. They wouldn't be able to react. There's all sorts of ways of extrapolating, right, possible meanings from this usage. Okay, but you have to understand the image and the metaphor that's embodied in this verb in order to understand it, right? Naval, this is, it would have to be something, here we're writing our metaphors in blue, okay? So Naval, right, is a vulture. And his activity toward the men of David was that of, okay, like a vulture. Okay, Gula?
A vulture wants to eat its prey, and in this case that's not analogous because I don't think that Naval wants anything out of David's men.
Therefore, not everything applies, but what does apply?
But isn't what we're saying that everything has to apply?
No, I'm saying the opposite. This doesn't, these are two blank areas. These are areas where there isn't any overlap. The overlap is not complete. There may be metaphors where the overlap is virtually complete, 95%, right? But in most cases, it's not. Most cases, it's not. For example, you can't go too literally. A famous metaphor, for example, right, is that arguing is warfare, right? I see your point, right? The point that you make in your argument, right, is like the point of the saber or whatever, and you see it, you recognize it, etc. Okay, that you talk about a battery of arguments, right, like a battery of weapons and an assault or whatever. Okay. However, not everything about arguing is warfare, right? For example, we could talk about the winner and the loser. We could talk about a defeat in a debate, but we don't necessarily have to have that. Plus, there isn't any physical violence, or at least one hopes that there isn't any physical violence in an argument, right? It's a whole part of warfare, right, that is missing, right, from the analogy, right, from the metaphor, or something. There's a very important component of the source domain that is not applicable in this case to the target domain. But that doesn't mean you don't use all sorts of metaphors that are connected to the metaphor. Argument is warfare. Okay, so that's one metaphor. Now let's look at another metaphor in the very, very same chapter. Okay, look in verse 16. Okay, now again, the man of David's private army, his party, right, is still reporting to Abigail, and he says, "V'ha'anashim tovim lanu ma'od." But Naval's people have been very nice to us. They've basically been very good. Okay, v'lo hochlamnu, right? We haven't been confounded. We haven't been tripped up. We haven't been shamed, or whatever exactly that means. Right? We haven't been dismayed. V'lo fakadnu mi'uma, right? We haven't, right, suffered anything. Kol yemei hit halachnu itam. All the time that we were going around with them, biyotenu basadeh. All the time that we're out with them in the field. Okay, now verse 16. Choma hayu aleinu. They were a wall about us. A wall, and not just a wall, a city wall. A choma is a city wall, and many people think it's from a root, chet mem yud, right, which means to protect. Right? It's the protective wall that surrounds them. So they were a protective wall. Gam laila, gam yomam. Both at night, when people really need the protection. And the people in ancient times put their houses together and made either an artificial wall, put a wall around the city, right? Not not only from enemies, but from wild animals. You got to keep the jackals out, etc. You don't want them taking away the the domestic animals or the children or whatever. Okay. In any case, you have this protective wall at night when you really need it. Gam yoman, and even by day, right, when it's ordinarily not necessary. People don't feel that they have to stay inside the city with the protective choma during the day. But these people were especially nice to us. They were choma for us, right, both by night and by day. Kol yemei heyotenu imam, all the time we were with them, ro'im hatzon, as we were busy with them, herding the sheep together. Okay. Now, since we happen to come, this is planned, okay, to this image of herding the sheep together, one of the most famous metaphors in all of the Bible, right, in Psalm 23. Hashem ro'i lo echsar. Psalm 23, verse 1. Mizmor LeDavid, Hashem ro'i lo echsar. Okay, now, what is the source here? What is the source domain? Sorry? Shepherding, right? The whole sphere of a shepherd taking care of a flock of sheep or goats. Okay? Because, sown can mean both sheep and goats. Okay, so there are the sheep and the goats. Hashem Roi, God is the shepherd, which means what else is implied by this metaphor? Who is the sheep? Right? The speaker or other people like the speaker in the psalm are the sheep. So Hashem Roi lo echsar. So first of all, in order to understand this entire metaphor, we have to understand both sides. We have to understand that the target here is something about the relationship between God and the individuals that are being discussed, right? But in order to understand this particular metaphor and its application, we have to understand the source domain, that what is involved in taking care of sheep and goats. What are the responsibilities of the shepherd? What are the extent? In Tanya Reinhardt's language, the focus is the shepherd, okay, herding, but the vehicle is the entire scene of herding. Now, there are a few things that are mentioned here, okay? First of all, Hashem Roi lo echsar, okay? I will not lack anything, right? I will not be missing anything. Okay, so in other words, it's already said that the shepherd is meant to provide things that are needed, so that there is no cheser, right? There's nothing that is, right, missing. But then he goes on, bin ot desha yarbitzeni, okay? The shepherd takes the sheep, right, and has them lie down in green pastures. Almei menuchot yinaleni, guides them, directs them beside still waters, etc., etc. Okay, these are two things. But what else is involved? What else is involved? That's the question that I think you need to answer if you're going to do a complete analysis of this metaphor. It's not enough just to say, oh, I get it. I have a solution. The riddle is, who is the shepherd? God is the shepherd. Or the riddle is, who is the sheep? I am the sheep. What does God do for me? But in order to answer this question, not only do we have to understand what the rest of the responsibilities of the shepherd are, we have to also understand what else do we know about the relationship between God and God's faithful. What else does God do for people, etc., etc., and how much of that can perhaps be identified in the domain of the herding of the sheep. These are questions that have to be answered by the exegete, by the person who's reading this text and trying to understand this text, not just in terms of basic comprehension, but in terms of understanding. I'll end just with a quote from the great American Jewish poet and critic, also great story writer, Delmore Schwartz, who wrote in one of his reviews, "He who runs cannot read." Reading means you have to stop, you have to think, etc., etc. Reading a poem requires this kind of reflection, and as we've seen, reading biblical prose and other prose, especially in which we find all sorts of rhetorical tropes and metaphor among them, we need to stop, think, in order to understand. Shalom Litrot. Next week, application to Job.